On a quiet afternoon just days after their wedding, a young bride and groom thought their story would be nothing more than vows, laughter, and the promise of a simple life. But when they stepped across the threshold of an old wooden cabin, an inheritance no one expected, the air seemed to shift. The groom saw only decay, a burden to be sold. Yet the bride felt warmth in the creaking floors, in the faded photographs, in the loyal gaze of their German shepherd. Then came the discovery. Hidden beneath the boards, a secret gleamed like fire in the dark. Gold, journals, and a legacy that would test their love and transform the man she had just married. This is not just an inheritance. It is a journey of loyalty, redemption, and the miracles that shine when we choose to give instead of keep. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments and let this story travel farther than the walls of this cabin. The city of Millersford lay beneath a sharp autumn sky, the air thin and cold, colored by the scent of pine and iron. Streets stretched with long shadows, shop windows glinted with late sun, and the wind moved through the alleys like an impatient guest. It was here, just days after their wedding, that Daniel Hart and his bride, Eleanor, began the journey that would test not only their marriage, but their very sense of what inheritance meant. Daniel was 28, broad-shouldered, with the face of a man built for labor and responsibility. His square jaw was always shadowed by stubble, a constant rebellion against the razor. His brown eyes carried both kindness and a deep fatigue, sharpened by debts that weighed on him like anchors. A carpenter by trade, he had once been known for easy laughter, but recent failures had taught him to scan every choice like a ledger. Life, to him, was numbers. Owed and unpaid. Eleanor, 26, was tall and slender, her chestnut hair pulled into a loose twist that let copper strands catch the light. Her skin glowed with a warm wheat tone, her gray-green eyes patient, listening, and alive with imagination. Where Daniel calculated, she believed. Where he saw risk, she saw possibility. She was the kind of woman who spoke softly to furniture as if it might answer, and people often did. Trotting before them was Kaiser, their German shepherd, 5 years old. His coat a blend of black, silver, and cream. Strong yet graceful, his amber eyes glowed with alert intelligence. He was not only a companion, but a guardian, a steadying presence for Daniel and a mirror to Eleanor's warmth. On the porch of a modest home stood Daniel's parents, Stephen and Marla Hart. Stephen, lean and graying, carried the quiet authority of a man who had balanced ledgers and lifted more weight than his body should have allowed. Marla, younger, brisk and capable, wore her pearl studs as if they were armor for the countless tasks she had mastered: house, business, and community. Their pride in their son was tempered with concern, though today they greeted the couple with smiles that tried to outshine worry. Inside, on a table, lay a heavy iron key and a folded paper. The key was old, worn smooth by generations of hands. The paper, in Daniel's grandfather's square script, listed the contents of a cabin that had not been touched in years: a stove that sighs, a roof that complains, cedar chairs that whisper of sap, a door that sticks unless asked with patience. "This was your grandfather's," Stephen said, voice steady. "We meant to tend it, but time slipped. Now it should pass to you." Marla added gently, "We hope you'll keep it. But if you cannot, we understand." Daniel's thoughts turned instantly to debts and repair costs. To him, the cabin was not a gift, but a liability. His lips pressed into a line. "It's generous," he said carefully, though inside he was already calculating what it might fetch if sold. Eleanor touched the paper. tracing the words with her finger. Her eyes softened, and she smiled. "We should see it. Let the house speak before the numbers do." Kaiser wagged his tail as if seconding the idea. The couple left with hugs, a loaf of Marla's apple bread, and the key heavy in Daniel's pocket. The drive north took them past the city's order into wide plains, where cottonwoods burned gold and green. The river lay low, showing its ribs of stone, while the mountains rose ahead, snow-crowned and eternal. Daniel's mind filled with ledgers and unpaid bills. Eleanor sat quietly, hand resting on Kaiser's back, her gaze distant. "I can almost hear it," she said softly. "The cabin breathing." Gravel replaced asphalt as the truck climbed. At last, the cabin appeared. Small, weathered, its roof sagging, porch leaning, windows fractured. Grass reclaimed the yard, and the air smelled of pine and old ash. It should have looked abandoned, yet it did not. Kaiser leapt down, circled the porch, ears forward, tail sweeping deliberate arcs. He returned, eyes bright, gaze fixed on the door as though acknowledging a sacred threshold. Daniel set the key in the lock. It resisted, then yielded smoothly, like a joint remembering movement. He pushed, and the door opened on a cool breath scented with pine, iron stove, and ghosted soap. Inside, dim shapes waited, table, chair, shelves, silent, expectant. They stood together on the threshold, Daniel weary and practical, Eleanor patient and hopeful, Kaiser solemn as a guardian. The cabin seemed to lean toward them, whispering, "I have kept the embers. Will you keep the light?" For tonight, Daniel made only one decision: to step inside, to listen, and to let the place breathe. The first night in the cabin was a mixture of silence and creaks, the kind of silence that doesn't comfort, but instead waits, thick and deliberate, while shadows leaned against the walls like watchmen who had forgotten their orders. Daniel dropped his duffel by the warped doorframe with a sigh that rattled more than the hinges. His boots, already scuffed, left wet prints from the dew-laden grass that had grown wild across what once must have been a proud yard. The porch groaned under his weight, and when the door closed behind him, the cabin seemed to exhale as though acknowledging their presence after years of neglect. Daniel struck a match, lit an oil lamp, and the dim light revealed the state of things in blunt honesty. The roof above bore stains where water had trickled and spread like bruises. The walls were paneled in old pine boards, now freckled with patches of mildew and seams that had loosened. The floor creaked unevenly beneath every step, and weeds had pushed through gaps between the porch planks, claiming the threshold as their own. He felt his jaw tighten. To his eyes, the cabin was a ledger written in red ink. Every corner a cost, every crack a reminder of what he could not afford. Eleanor entered more slowly, her gaze softer, lingering. She slipped her coat from her tall frame and draped it over a rickety chair, her movements deliberate as though she were stepping into a church rather than a house. The lamplight caught the copper in her hair, making her appear almost woven into the cabin's faded wood and dust. She ran her slender fingers across a shelf, feeling the grit, then lifting down a photograph. It was framed in cheap tin, but carried the dignity of time. A man in uniform, standing stiffly with a stare both proud and weary, his cap tilted, his mouth set in a line too firm for comfort. Daniel glanced over. "That's him?" he asked flatly. "Yes," Eleanor whispered, brushing dust from the glass. "Your grandfather. Look at his eyes, Daniel. He was strong, but not hard. There's warmth there." Daniel gave a non-committal grunt. To him, the picture was only another relic of a man whose choices had now become his burden. But Kaiser had padded quietly across the room and stopped before the photograph. The German shepherd's ears lifted, his body still, His amber eyes locked on the soldier's face as though he recognized something invisible. His tail gave a single, slow wag, not playful, but reverent. Daniel frowned, unsettled. "It's just a picture, boy." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Maybe he sees more than we do." On a nearby table sat a cracked wooden box. Eleanor opened it gently, revealing a tattered Bible, its leather cover worn nearly smooth, its pages yellowed and brittle. She turned a few leaves carefully, pausing at underlined verses, her lips moving silently as she traced her fingertip across passages about faith and endurance. "He carried this with him," she said softly. "It must have been important." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "Faith doesn't fix roofs." "No," she replied, still looking at the pages. "But it helps keep a man standing when the world tries to break him. Maybe that's why he built this place. To stand." On the mantel sat another relic, a small music box, its brass hinges tarnished, its wood chipped. Eleanor wound the key carefully, but it caught halfway, grinding, then released with a hesitant sound. The melody emerged fractured, only a fragment of a tune, rising, faltering, and stopping as though the box itself had grown weary. Yet even broken, the notes carried a sweetness, a memory that belonged to another era. Eleanor's face softened, her eyes glistening in the flickering light. "It's still trying," she murmured, "even after all these years." Daniel turned away, frustration curling his shoulders. He paced to the window where vines crept through cracks in the frame, where the yard outside looked like a jungle reclaiming a kingdom. "All I see is rot," he muttered. "Rot and work we can't pay for. We could sell the land. Developers would tear this down and put something new here. We'd have money. Real money." Eleanor turned toward him, holding the photograph close. Her voice was gentle but firm. "And what would you lose? This isn't just wood and nails. It's memory, Daniel. It's a story waiting to be told." He met her gaze, hard lines deepening at the corners of his mouth. "Stories don't pay debts." The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of their different visions. Kaiser broke it with a low whine, stepping forward to press against Daniel's leg, eyes still shifting back toward the soldier's photograph, as if urging him not to dismiss what mattered. Daniel sighed and scratched the dog's head, though the tension in his body did not ease. The lamplight dimmed as the oil burned lower, shadows growing longer. Eleanor returned the photograph to its place with care, setting the Bible and music box beside it. She looked around the cabin, at the peeling boards, the stains, the cluttered corners, and she saw not ruin, but possibility. Daniel saw costs stacked higher than he could ever climb. And in that quiet divide, the cabin itself seemed to listen, holding its breath, as if it knew the truth. Within its walls, more secrets still waited, stories neither of them yet understood. The night arrived colder than expected, a sharp wind clawing through the gaps in the old cabin walls. Daniel had patched one window with a blanket to keep the drafts at bay, but the chill still found them, curling around their ankles as if the house itself were testing their resolve. Outside, the trees rattled like bones, and the moon spread a pale silver sheen across the clearing. Eleanor sat near the small iron stove, coaxing a weak flame into life with scraps of dry wood she had found in the shed. Her face glowed in the flickering light, her gray-green eyes intent, her slender fingers steady as she nursed warmth into existence. She was tired but calm, her tall frame folded into a chair that looked ready to collapse, yet cradled her as though it remembered her grandfather's hands building it. Daniel, restless, paced the floorboards, his shoulders drawn tight. He hated the creaks, the stains, the way every gust seemed to mock his decision to even step foot here. He glanced at his wife, who appeared unfazed, and at Kaiser sprawled near the fire, his silver-gray coat gleaming like hammered metal in the light. The German shepherd was 5 years old, broad-chested and muscular, his muzzle proud, and his amber eyes bright even in the shadows. He had served Daniel as much more than a pet. He was a constant sentinel, a partner, a presence that steadied him when life pressed too hard. Suddenly, Kaiser's ears flicked upright. He rose in one swift motion, muscles tensed, and let out a low growl that deepened into a bark sharp enough to echo through the rafters. Eleanor startled, dropping the small stick she had been holding, while Daniel cursed under his breath. "What now?" he muttered, but the dog was already moving. Kaiser dashed across the room, claws clicking against the uneven wood, and bounded toward the narrow staircase leading to the attic. His barking grew louder, insistent, a summons rather than mere alarm. Eleanor stood quickly, clutching her shawl around her slim shoulders, her chestnut hair loosening from its twist so that strands framed her wheat-toned face. "Something's up there," she whispered, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Daniel frowned. "Probably a raccoon or a draft. Nothing more." Yet Kaiser's urgency carried a different weight. His barks were rhythmic, demanding, not the frantic tones of chasing prey. He was calling them. Reluctantly, Daniel lit a lantern and started up the narrow staircase. The steps complained under his weight, each groan a warning. Eleanor followed, her hand brushing the rail, her heart racing with anticipation. The attic smelled of dust and neglect, the air thick with years of silence. Cobwebs draped the beams like forgotten curtains. But Kaiser had stopped before a panel of warped boards near the far end, his body rigid, his tail still, ears pitched forward. He stood like a soldier at attention, his amber eyes fixed. Daniel approached, lifting the lantern. The wood was mottled with rot, its grain swollen from damp. And there, just above eye level on a supporting beam, faint letters had been carved long ago. The words were shallow, nearly erased by time, but still readable. "Ngoi gyu lua hai tim noi soon hat." Eleanor shivered, not from the cold, but from the strangeness of it. Her voice came soft, reverent. "The keeper of the flame. Find the deepest place." She reached out, her slender finger tracing the letters as though they might burn her. Her eyes glistened, and she turned toward her husband. "Daniel, it's a message. It has to mean something." Daniel shook his head, jaw tight. "It's nonsense. Old words carved by a bored man with a knife. My grandfather probably left it when he was drunk. You can't let this house put ideas in your head." His tone was clipped, dismissive, though the weight in his gaze betrayed unease. Eleanor's breath caught as a gust of wind blew through a crack in the shingles. It threaded through the rafters and past the warped panel, creating a hollow whistle. To her ears, the sound bent itself into a broken melody, the same hesitant tune from the little music box downstairs. She froze, her tall frame stiff, her eyes widening in recognition. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. Daniel frowned, straining his ears. To him, it was only wind. He shook his head. "It's just air moving through rotten wood." But Eleanor clutched her shawl tighter, her chest rising quickly. "No, it's the same as the box, the same unfinished song. This house is trying to speak." Kaiser let out a low, resonant whine, his gaze shifting between the etched words and Eleanor, as though affirming her belief. His body language was certain, unwavering, a soldier confirming the path. Daniel dragged a hand across his stubbled jaw, exhaling sharply. "You're reading ghosts into dust. I won't waste another second chasing riddles. We need money, not mysteries." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the weight of debts pressing on him, the years of feeling cornered. Eleanor stepped closer to the beam, her chestnut hair catching the lantern light, her gray-green eyes alive with conviction. What if it's not a riddle? What if it's a guide? He called himself the keeper of the flame. What if he left something for us to find, something more than decay? The wind surged again, the whistle swelling into a ghostly echo of the music box's broken tune. The sound lingered, haunting, then faded into silence. Daniel turned away, muttering, "Coincidence." But Eleanor stood rooted, trembling with the certainty that it was not. The cabin had whispered, and she was listening. They descended the stairs in silence. Daniel's face was hard, his lips a grim line, while Eleanor clutched the lantern as though holding on to a truth only she could see. Kaiser followed, his movements deliberate, his tail brushing her side like reassurance. The house groaned softly around them, its boards flexing as the wind pressed, and Eleanor thought she could feel the pulse of something hidden, alive, waiting to be uncovered. That night, Daniel lay awake on the creaking bed, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts knotted in numbers and frustration. Beside him, Eleanor turned slowly, her gray-green eyes open to the dark, her mind echoing with the carved words, "The keeper of the flame. Find the deepest place." And somewhere between them, Kaiser lifted his head, ears alert, as though he alone knew that the house had not yet finished speaking. The wind had died by morning, leaving behind a stillness that clung to the cabin like a secret. Daniel rose early, his broad shoulders tight beneath his worn flannel, jaw set as though the night's argument had been etched into his muscles. He busied himself with checking the yard, stomping through the tall weeds with grim purpose, muttering about repairs and lumber costs. Eleanor, however, remained inside, her tall, slender frame bent gracefully as she examined the warped panel in the attic once more. Her chestnut hair, untamed from sleep, fell loosely over her wheat-toned skin as she traced the faint carving with patient fingers. The words, "Ngoigyu lua hai tim noi saun hat," refused to let go of her thoughts. Kaiser padded beside her, his silver-gray coat gleaming even in the dusty light filtering through cracks in the roof. His amber eyes were sharp, ears swiveling as though he could hear the house breathe. He stood before the rotten plank and let out a low sound, half whine, half command. Eleanor pressed her lips together. "All right, boy," she whispered. "We'll see what you're trying to show us." Armed with nothing more than Daniel's hammer, she carefully began pulling the nails from the warped board. They squealed in protest, sending vibrations through the attic beams. Dust fell in thin veils, coating her hair and clinging to her lashes. But she worked methodically, her tall figure stooping under the low ceiling as she pried each nail free. When the last board gave way, a hollow sound answered, and Kaiser barked once, sharp and triumphant. Behind the plank was a recessed hatch, nearly invisible against the timbers. Eleanor's breath caught. She pressed her slender fingers against it, and after a reluctant groan, the hatch swung open, revealing a narrow set of wooden steps descending into darkness. By the time Daniel returned, sweat dampening his temples from the cold labor outdoors, he found his wife kneeling by the opening. His eyes widened, disbelief hardening his features. "Eleanor, what the hell did you do?" His voice was sharp, weary. She lifted her gray-green eyes to him, shining with certainty. "I didn't break it, Daniel. It was built to be found." She gestured to the narrow steps. "This is what your grandfather meant." Daniel's jaw clenched, but curiosity cut through his frustration. Lantern in hand, he descended first, the creak of the steps echoing into the hollow below. Eleanor followed close, clutching the lantern's spare wick, and Kaiser padded down after them, his paws steady as if he already knew the path. At the bottom the air was cooler, carrying the scent of old wood and iron. The chamber was small, lined with planks that had aged but not rotted, a hidden room carefully constructed beneath the cabin. In its center rested a large iron chest, its surface mottled with rust yet solid, its corners reinforced with brass. Daniel ran a calloused hand over the lid, tracing the shallow dents, while Eleanor's slender fingers sought the latch. It gave reluctantly, squealing like a thing unused to company. Together they lifted the lid, and the lantern light fell upon a brilliance that made both of them still. Inside lay neat rows of small ingots, each wrapped carefully in cloth, their golden edges gleaming faintly even through the covering. The light danced across them, scattering reflections onto the wooden beams like tiny suns. Eleanor's breath trembled in her throat. "Gold," she whispered. Daniel staggered back a step, rubbing his hand over his stubbled jaw. His brown eyes widened with disbelief, then narrowed with suspicion. How did he get this?" Nestled atop the stacks was a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age, its clasp worn thin. Eleanor lifted it gently, her long fingers treating it as something sacred. She opened the cover, and neat handwriting, deliberate and strong despite age, filled the pages. She read aloud, her voice steady but hushed. "I kept what little I could save. Not for myself, but for them. The men who came home broken, the children who lost their fathers. I meant to build a fund, a light in their darkness. But my body weakens, and my time shortens. The task remains unfinished." Her eyes lifted to Daniel's, shimmering with emotion. She turned the page, and there, scrawled in his grandfather's precise script, was a list of names. Soldiers, widows, orphans, each carefully written, some with notes beside them. Needs surgery, lost farm, 2 children without school. The list ended abruptly, the last line unfinished, as though the pen had slipped from his grandfather's hand before he could write more. Daniel's throat tightened, his broad chest rising sharply as he fought conflicting currents inside. To him, the gold was salvation. Debts paid, burdens lifted. But hearing his grandfather's intent, every name tethered to pain and sacrifice, shook him in ways he had not expected. He rubbed his rough fingers across his brow, muttering, "Why leave this to me?" Eleanor closed the journal carefully, holding it against her heart. Her gray-green eyes glowed with a quiet fire. "Because he trusted you. Because he believed this house, this family could carry on what he started." Kaiser nudged Daniel's hand, amber eyes solemn, as if urging him to see more than numbers. Daniel swallowed hard, looking once more into the chest where gold gleamed like silent witnesses to his grandfather's unfinished mission. The weight of choice pressed down on him, heavier than any debt ledger he had ever kept. And for the first time since stepping into the cabin, Daniel felt that maybe this inheritance was not a burden, but a calling. The lantern burned low, its dim halo just enough to light the outlines of the iron chest and the scattered shadows that swayed across the hidden room. Daniel stood over the open ruang, his broad chest heaving as though the gold itself had awakened something raw and long buried inside him. His square jaw clenched, the muscles twitching as he stared at the neat stacks of ingots, each bar a promise of freedom he had never known. His brown eyes, normally dulled by weariness, were alight now, fierce, glittering with the reflection of wealth. Eleanor, tall and slender, sat on the edge of the wooden step that led into the chamber. Her gray-green eyes were calm but resolute, the old journal clutched in her long, graceful fingers. Chestnut strands of hair fell over her wheat-toned cheeks, dust clinging to her skin, but she seemed almost untouched by it, as though the discovery of the journal had wrapped her in quiet fire. Kaiser lay at her feet, his silver-gray coat shining faintly even in the dim light, amber eyes fixed on Daniel as if reading every thought before it left his lips. Daniel finally broke the silence, his voice rough, almost trembling. "Eleanor, don't you see? This changes everything. The debts, the shame, the endless grind. We can pay it all. I won't have to walk around with people whispering behind my back, waiting for me to fail. We can start over. This is our chance." His words came fast, jagged, the weight of years of frustration spilling out. "I don't want to be the man everyone looks down on anymore. I'm done being pitied." Eleanor opened the journal to a page marked by her grandfather's firm, fading hand. She read aloud, her voice steady, clear despite the quiver in her chest. "This gold belongs to those who suffer, to the broken soldiers and the children without fathers. It is not mine, nor for those who carry my blood. It is theirs, and only theirs." She closed the book gently, pressing it to her chest. Her gray-green eyes lifted to Daniel's, unwavering. "It was never meant for us." Daniel barked a short, bitter laugh, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw as if to wipe away the words. Easy for a dead man to say. He never saw what it's like now. He never had to stand in front of a banker who smiles like a wolf. He never had to lie awake, knowing tomorrow brings nothing but more failure. You think his noble words are going to keep the roof over our heads? Eleanor rose, her tall frame straightening, her chestnut hair falling like a banner around her face. She stepped closer, her slender hand trembling slightly as she held up the journal. "This is more than noble words. It's his last will, his calling. If we betray that, what kind of people are we? Daniel, don't you see? He trusted us with his mission. Not just to keep the gold safe, but to make sure it reaches those who need it." For a moment, Daniel faltered. The lines around his mouth softened, his leaf-brown eyes flicking too, hers as if caught by the flame of her conviction. But then the weight of his past pressed in again, louder, heavier. He slammed the chest shut, the clang echoing like thunder in the hidden room. "I don't care what he wrote. I care about us. About not living like failures, about finally having a future that isn't just scraping by." His voice broke, raw and sharp. "I won't spend the rest of my life poor just so we can honor some old ghost's dream." Kaiser rose to his feet, barking once, the sound sharp and cutting through the thick air. He stood between them, tail stiff, amber eyes fixed on Daniel with the kind of steady reproach only a loyal creature could give. Daniel looked away, his shoulders sagging but his fists clenched tight. Eleanor's voice lowered, almost pleading now, though her eyes still glowed with fire. "Daniel, this gold was meant to heal, to lift others, not ourselves. If we keep it, we lose more than honor. We lose who we are meant to be." Her words hit him like stones against a wall already cracked. He turned abruptly, anger and despair swirling like smoke in his chest. Without another word, he climbed the narrow stairs out of the hidden chamber, his boots striking hard against the wood. The lantern swayed in his grip as he stormed out of the cabin into the cold night, the door slamming shut behind him. Eleanor sank to her knees beside the chest, clutching the journal as though it were the last fragile flame in a storm. Kaiser pressed against her side, his warm body grounding her as his amber eyes reflected quiet certainty. His gaze seemed to say what words could not. "Hold fast. Keep the faith. The house is with you." And in the silence left behind by Daniel's anger, the cabin creaked softly, like an old voice whispering its agreement. Morning broke clear and cold, a pale sun rising above the ridge and casting long beams through the frost-laden trees. The cabin's roof glistened with dew, and smoke from the small stove curled into the air like a prayer too faint to reach heaven. Eleanor stood tall and slender in the doorway, her chestnut hair swept back loosely, strands glinting copper under the early light. Her wheat-toned skin was pale with determination, her gray-green eyes soft yet unwavering as she pressed the old leather journal against her chest. At her feet, Kaiser shifted, his silver-gray coat shimmering, amber eyes alert, as if he too understood what this day demanded. Daniel had not returned until dawn. He came in weary, his brown eyes bloodshot, his broad shoulders sagging beneath his flannel shirt. His stubbled jaw looked harsher in the morning light, and the lines around his mouth carved deeper, etched by a night spent wrestling with anger and guilt. He did not speak to Eleanor, only dropped onto a chair, burying his face in his hands. He looked less like a husband, and more like a man cornered by life itself. Eleanor did not argue with him. Instead, she kissed the cover of the journal, slipped on her worn coat, and stepped into the crisp air with Kaiser at her side. She carried the weight of the key to the iron chest, her slender fingers tight around it, and walked down the path toward town. Daniel remained behind, staring at the floorboards that still seemed to echo with his grandfather's words. The town of Millersford stirred slowly to life, its modest streets lined with brick storefronts and sagging porches. Eleanor's tall frame moved gracefully through the morning bustle, her chestnut hair stirring in the wind. She entered the modest office of the town's community trust, a faded green building with peeling paint, but warm lamps glowing in the windows. Behind the desk sat Mr. Whitaker, an elderly man with thinning white hair and spectacles perched on the end of his nose. His frame was bent, his hands spotted with age, yet his blue eyes still carried the spark of service. He had once been a schoolteacher, known for his patience and unshakable honesty. Eleanor laid the iron chest before him. His wrinkled brow furrowed in surprise, then softened with reverence as she opened the lid. Golden light spilled into the dim office, and his breath caught. "Child, what is this?" "It was my husband's grandfather's legacy," Eleanor said gently, her gray-green eyes shining. "It was meant for the veterans, the widows, the orphans. I want you to see it placed where it belongs." Tears welled in Whitaker's eyes as he touched one of the ingots with trembling fingers. "I taught your grandfather once," he whispered. "He had the heart of a soldier, but also the kindness of a shepherd. He would be proud of you." By midday, word spread like fire. The chest's contents were quickly converted into aid. Winter coats for orphans, medicine for frail, veterans, hot meals steaming in the town hall. Children with hollow cheeks pulled woolen scarves close around their necks, their laughter piercing the chill like bells. A veteran missing a leg saluted as tears streamed down his weathered face. An old woman pressed a loaf of fresh bread into Eleanor's hands with gratitude too deep for words. Kaiser walked among them like a quiet guardian, tail swaying, ears pricked as if proud of what had been set in motion. Daniel came into town later, drawn not by curiosity but by a gnawing ache in his chest. He had spent the morning pacing the cabin, muttering, clenching his fists, but finally his feet carried him down the dirt path. When he arrived, he found not chaos but a miracle unfolding before his eyes. Near the steps of the town hall, an elderly veteran sat hunched on a bench. His frame was thin, his face carved with lines of hardship, his hands trembling as he clutched a new blanket draped across his shoulders. When Daniel approached, the man looked up, his clouded eyes filling with recognition. With effort, he reached for Daniel's rough, calloused hand and clasped it tightly. His voice was fragile, but it carried the weight of generations. "Thank you, son," he whispered. "You've kept your father's fire burning. You've held the light of our people." Daniel froze, his broad chest rising sharply, his brown eyes stinging as though smoke had entered them. The words struck deeper than any debt, any ledger breaking through the fortress of bitterness he had built. His grandfather's journal, Eleanor's unwavering faith, the children's laughter, all of it rushed into him like a flood against stone. For the first time, his shoulders bent not from debt, but from humility. Eleanor watched from a distance, her tall frame outlined against the winter sun, her chestnut hair whipping in the breeze. She held no pride in her eyes, only quiet love. Kaiser sat at her side, tail sweeping slowly, amber gaze fixed on Daniel as if witnessing a transformation. Daniel dropped to his knees before the old veteran, clasping the frail hands tighter, his stubble brushing his lips as he bowed his head. Tears spilled freely down his cheeks, hot and unrelenting. He whispered, "I understand now. It was never about us. It was about them. About giving, not taking." The veteran smiled faintly, his lips trembling. "Then you've learned what your grandfather always hoped you would." And in that moment, Daniel's heart cracked open, the selfishness that had bound him shattering like brittle glass. What remained was a man not defined by debts or failure, but by the light of compassion that now burned within him. By the time winter softened its grip, the story of the gold and the journal had spread far beyond Millersford. What began as whispers in the town square soon became a stream of veterans, widows, and wanderers finding their way up the gravel path to the weathered wooden cabin. The roof no longer leaked. The porch stood straight after Daniel's long hours of work with saw and hammer. The air inside carried the fragrance of pine wood fires and bread that Eleanor baked, her tall, slender figure moving gracefully through the kitchen, her chestnut hair tied back but never fully tamed, her gray-green eyes warm as she welcomed each guest with patience. The cabin had changed, but so had Daniel, his broad shoulders no longer bent under invisible burdens. His brown eyes, once narrowed with bitterness, now softened when they rested on the people who entered. The stubble on his square jaw remained, but it no longer marked neglect. It was simply part of the rugged kindness that had grown in him. The man who once measured worth by debts and gold now measured it by the strength of a handshake or the gratitude in a stranger's eyes. Kaiser lay most afternoons on the porch, his silver-gray coat gleaming in the light, amber eyes watching every new arrival with the steady vigilance of a guardian. Children who came with their widowed mothers often curled against his flank, safe beneath his protective gaze, while veterans patted his head with rough hands and murmured thanks. It was as though the German shepherd understood that his duty had grown larger than one family. It was to the wounded and lost who came seeking a place to rest. The cabin took on a new name, carved into a simple wooden sign Daniel hung above the door: the Shepherd's Gate. Eleanor had chosen it, and Daniel had agreed without hesitation. It was both a nod to Kaiser and to the spirit of the house itself, a place where those wandering in shadows could step into light. One late afternoon, when the snowmelt left the ground muddy and the sky burned with streaks of orange, a knock sounded at the door. Eleanor opened it to find a young soldier standing on the stoop. He could not have been more than 20, his frame lean and trembling beneath a thin jacket. His face was hollow, his skin pale as parchment, and his dark eyes stared forward with a vacancy that spoke of nights too long, battles too raw. His hair was unkempt, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched a worn duffel. Eleanor's gray-green eyes softened, and she reached out her slender hand. "Come in," she said gently, her wheat-toned face calm, her voice like the first warm day of spring. The boy hesitated, eyes flicking between her kindness and the shadows behind him. But then Daniel stepped forward. His tall frame filled the doorway, his brown eyes steady. He placed his calloused hand firmly on the young man's narrow shoulder. "This house is yours too," Daniel said, his deep voice carrying both strength and compassion. "Stay. Begin again here." The soldier's lips trembled. He nodded once, unable to form words, and Daniel guided him inside. Eleanor brewed tea in a chipped porcelain pot, her graceful movements filling the cabin with warmth. Daniel cleared a cot by the stove, smoothing the blanket himself, every motion careful, deliberate, as if to prove his own transformation to his wife, to Kaiser, to the spirit of his grandfather. The boy sat slowly, steam rising from the cup Eleanor placed into his shaking hands. Tears welled in his hollow eyes, falling silently onto his cheeks. Daniel sat beside him, not speaking, only offering his presence like a solid wall against the storms that had hollowed the youth's spirit. Outside, Kaiser stretched on the porch, his tail brushing against the wooden boards, a steady rhythm like a heartbeat. The sun dipped lower, shadows lengthened, and the cabin glowed from within, its light spilling through the windows into the gathering dusk. The gold was gone now, transformed into coats, medicine, food, shelter, but what remained was far more enduring. The Shepherd's Gate was not built of wealth, but of compassion. It was the true inheritance, the living legacy of a grandfather whose flame had not died but been carried forward. And as the night deepened, Daniel looked at Eleanor, his brown eyes meeting her gray-green gaze. He smiled softly, not the smile of relief or triumph, but of understanding. He had changed, and so had the house. Together they had become keepers of the flame. Sometimes, the greatest treasures left behind are not gold or land, but the quiet missions entrusted to our hearts. What Daniel and Eleanor found in that old wooden cabin was not simply an inheritance. It was a calling, a reminder that even in broken places, God can breathe new purpose. The Shepherd's Gate was proof that when love meets faith, miracles walk among us, often on four legs, often in the faces of strangers seeking shelter. In our daily lives, we too are called to be keepers of light. We may not uncover hidden gold, but we can offer warmth, kindness, and compassion, gifts that carry far greater value in God's eyes. Just as Daniel learned, giving is not the loss of treasure, but the multiplication of it. And just as Eleanor believed, what we do with blessings entrusted to us is the true measure of our legacy. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to share it with someone who needs hope. Leave us a comment below, let us know where you are watching from, and join our community by subscribing. May God bless you and your family with peace, courage, and the strength to see the miracles hidden in everyday life.